What's exciting for me and for the Authentic Leadership Institute, which I represent around executive coaching, is that we are finally getting to the place where we have a model that allows us to be able to really help senior executives resolve the internal incongruencies and parts of themselves that are in conflict, that tend to generate that expression of one day they are really wonderful, and the next day it's the day that you don't want to have a conversation with them. And in the past, we've sort of tended to sort of tiptoe around some of those things. But we've started to really have some powerful impact and results on how to resolve some of those things and make them where the person truly is able to be more congruent across a level of experiences, across a level of time that is a different way of operating, and much more important in the world that we live in today, which has much more of an external crisis orientation, but how to create that peace on the inside. I think we've spent the last 10 or 15 years working on that. And I think we're getting to the place now where the models that really help us achieve that are becoming much more crystal clear. So that's really what's exciting for me. I was dealing with, I was coaching a senior executive yesterday, and basically this is a person who's been written up in a bunch of Harvard Business School cases, as well as an HBR article and so forth, an exemplar woman in the technology world. And she found herself in a place where she was being a bully. And she really realized that there's these two parts of herself. There's the part that's nice and wonderful, and there's the part that at some point, when things aren't getting done, she just starts taking a bat and taking it out on people. And we started to be able to use this approach to be able to then find out what was really underneath that tension as to what was causing that to happen, and being able to resolve that in a way where she saw that there was benefit in both of the underlying intentions of how she was expressing herself, but that there was a different way of approaching the whole situation that would be much more leader-like and much more congruent with what she's espousing as the values in the organization. And she felt that internal connection and being able to really get at a deeper level what it meant to operate from that place. And that was, we were able to do that whole thing in about 45 minutes. And so the point here, I think, is the other challenge within coaching is that you don't have the kind of time that you would in a therapeutic context. When you once a week for an hour you work with someone and you have time. Here we might have an hour once a month or so with somebody, and we have to have a significant shift in how they're impacting themselves as well as others. So that's in some sense what's really becoming exciting and an example of what we're being able to do with some of those stuff. Having taken a therapeutic model and applying it in a coaching context, the question becomes is what's the boundary between what's appropriate to be done in a coaching setting? We've spent a lot of time working on that. There is a level of the leading your internal team model that is very appropriate in a coaching context that we've used and applied and had really great results, and gets us a place that we can't get with any of the other tools that we have in our toolbox for coaching around resolving some of these internal incongruencies in their personality and style and how they approach stuff. There's a point at which the dialogue shifts and it becomes very clear what that is, in which you realize that you're getting to some place that really requires more of a regular therapeutic intervention. One of the nice things about the LIT model is because Dick Schwartz has spent the last 10 years training about 10,000 therapists on the model, there's a very good set of resources to be able to hand this person off to them and then do the deeper work if they're willing to do it, if they're ready to do it, and then work in conjunction with that person where we're staying within the coaching context and the other person is working on the therapeutic side. So that's one of the other things that's really interesting about this, is it actually gives people the chance of having the deeper piece of it without it having to happen within the coaching session. Well, let's put it this way. One of the challenges and one of the great things about coaching in coaches is that people are very clear about what's the contract that they have to do what kind of work with the participant or the client. They're also aware that much of what happens when you're doing really good coaching goes to a place that for the most part has a deep interpersonal connection, and there's sort of this zone you get into where there's a flow of what's happening, and it's kind of hard to describe what the process is you may have been using as much as what you know is you know what it feels and it feels like when you're in that place. Much of the LIT model is about codifying how do you get into that place really quickly with people in a way that lets you have much more control over what's actually happening so that you don't slip into getting into the therapy place, but you are able to do some of the deep work that is appropriate for that context. And when we're doing the training, we spend a good deal of time helping people understand the distinction between, where the line is between those two places. The good news is that we actually really have that line. So it makes it where you really know what the power of the process is, and you also know where you are in relation to what's an appropriate thing to do in that context or not. Once you understand the model, there's a set of distinctions of what you're doing when you're interacting with someone where it's very clear where's the place that you don't go versus where the places you would go in a coaching context. The simple way to put it is this, is that if I take this person that I was just describing to you who happened to be struggling between the bully part of themselves and the angelic part of themselves, okay? And we all sort of have those parts of ourselves. And what happens in this model is that the more time we spend in our angelic part, at some point the bully part says, okay, I've had enough of this, and it comes screaming in and tends to create mischief, and it's a little bit cumbersome as to when it shows up. And we all know what it looks like in our partners, right, when those other things happen. And the challenge is when we optimize around one, then the other one has to be just as strong in its sort of reaction the other way, and there sort of tends to be this sort of cycling that happens. The resolving that, there's two levels of resolving it. In the coaching context, there's an ability to be able to get there to be a straight dialogue with one of these parts. The challenge we have with most of us with a bully is we have judgments and evaluations about us being that way. Now, in some sense, the challenge in the opportunity in this model is to get all those voices out of the way, so the only thing we're doing is actually being present with whatever that part is that has been expressing itself in that way. And when that happens, usually its affect completely changes. And it all of a sudden usually becomes a part that feels that it's been, it's like, in some sense, it's like a team member that's been overusing its role. And the point is, this doesn't want to have to do that. It's as tired as anybody else, but it doesn't know how to stop. So it's how do you get it to calm down? Now, the reality is that a lot of times that when someone on a team is operating that way, the reason they're operating that way is because something that's not in the room that's happening that no one wants to talk about, okay? In some sense, going and finding out what that is internally and understanding what it is still within the context of coaching. Addressing and resolving the underlying pattern, okay, that causes that to happen in the first place, many times ends up becoming a therapeutic issue as opposed to a coaching issue. But getting to the point where some of these other pieces get resolved will usually have such a positive impact on their ability to be much more congruent, okay, that it doesn't end up, the coaching ends up being very powerful, and many times over a period of time, the client will then say, okay, you know what, there's a piece of work I need to do that has to do with something that isn't related to this, but keeps coming up. And then there's the contracting with, okay, how are they going to go about doing that? And are they ready to do that work? Many of the people we're dealing with are people who have never done a day of reflection in their life. Exactly. Okay? So we need to start with where they are and help them go on the journey. Okay? Those of us who are trained as clinicians and so forth, we can easily diagnose what the issue is and what they should do to address it, but that's not going to get them to go there. So the point about the leading your internal team model is it's a metaphor. It says, look, the external team that operates around you has a set of members on it who all play different roles. Some are very extroverted, some are introverted, some are strategic, some are tactical, some tend to jump up and down and get angry, some are always quiet and calm. And that the truth of the matter is that system outside of us, there needs to be a leader. There needs to be someone leading the show who's then choosing which of those aspects is playing out in a particular context, and each has appropriate context. And when it's not done, then the extrovert's always talking and no one else ever gets a word in edgewise, right? Well, the truth is that the same is happening inside of us. Okay, we have different aspects. We have the critic, we have the positive side, we have the victim side. We have all these different aspects of ourselves internally. And the challenge is that for many of us, there isn't the leader who's actually running the show. And what happens is on any given day, one of them ends up running a show based on external events that then trigger them to show up and say, okay, I'm going to try to take over this meeting and run it. And the goal of this model is to get it where there's choice. Okay, so what we're really trying to do is give executives an opportunity to be much more present to what is it that is actually, what part of them is actually in charge in the moment, and how to have it be more self-led, more of an authentic self that's driving the show, as opposed to the aspect of them that happens to be the quick-fire aim part, or whatever the pace may be. The system we've operated in, authentic leadership is something that in the last 10 years or so has become more prominent as a label or a reference for what we're looking for. And these days in the news, you can see all the examples of the people who aren't being authentic for the most part. You don't have to work very hard. And when I'm teaching programs, it used to be every 3 or 4 months I'd have a good article I could use. Now it's like on a daily basis. I just have to open up to the front page, and the latest version is just standing there looking at me. I'm like, gosh, hand it to me on a plate. Authentic leaders, in the sense that we're talking about, are people who are really clear about who they are, and they're operating from that unique expression of their leadership instead of trying to follow someone else's model. B, they're driven by their purpose versus their ego. Now that's the big distinction, okay? And most of us see leaders as being people who are more ego-driven. But when we look at what Jim Collins in the early part of the 21st century wrote about level 5 leaders, which he refers to as people with a deep level of humility plus focused on long-term sustainable results, which was the opposite of the Jack Welches and all these charismatic guys that are out there. We're looking at something that's quieter, deeper, and there's no bling to it, I guess is one way to put it. It's actually boring in some ways. But authentic leadership is around accessing that part, and it's about how to make very hard decisions independent of political expediency, focusing on the long term. And the ability to operate from that place requires people to go in and find that part of themselves that is operating from that truth. And the ability to access that and know it is the first piece. And then it's how do you make it where you can do it in more places where under more stress you're still able to operate from that place. So the LIT, leading your internal team model, is what we use when we're doing coaching with people to say, now that you know this part of yourself is your deeper, authentic self, now let's look at all the places you operate from that. And now let's look at the places where you don't, where you end up all of a sudden having this other part of you which ends up sort of hijacking your system and ends up creating mischief for you and everybody else as a result. And then we use the LIT model to give them the ability to reconfigure their internal team and help take it where everybody trusts the leader in a different way. Because the reason why these parts of us, or parts of executives do this, is because they don't trust anything else that's going on, right? They just come in, they're like firefighters, they come in, they scream in, they sort of jump in and say, time out, I'll take over. And in this sense, it's about having the system reacquaint itself with that deeper aspect of themselves so that it is able to say, oh, okay, I got it, I don't have to participate, I can step back, the leader's here, it's going to be okay, and to start reconfiguring the system so that it's a much more healthy way of responding to the challenges. You know, if you're flying on a US Air flight out of LaGuardia, it's a beautiful day, and you look outside, you see New York City, and all of a sudden the captain comes on and says, welcome to the flight, we have only one slight problem, which is the engines are no longer running, right? So the question is, who do you want to have be the pilot of that plane? Do you want to have somebody whose internal team is very well aligned and saying, okay, let's see what we need to do, and has been through challenges and knows that they can figure out how to plan this thing and they're going to land it in the Hudson and it's going to be okay? Or do you want somebody for which there's a cacophony of voices going on in which there's no concurrence and basically there's a panic going on inside of their head as well as in the cockpit, right? It's pretty clear which one we want, right? So the same thing's true with leaders. And the challenge is that when things are good, for the most part, these are not the aspects that we see. What we need to do is in using this, is be able to help executives really be able to work on these parts of themselves that show up but work on them long before the more challenging scenarios happen. If we look at the whole economic impact of the last 2 or 3 years and the decisions that weren't made that could have been made, we can argue as to why, but in some ways it's this deeper authenticity that we're all hungry for. And if that was where people were operating from, we would have seen a different outcome. Right now, one of the people that we're working with is Paul Pullman, who's the CEO of Unilever. And we're doing a large program in Unilever right now and rolling that out. Paul has decided that their goal for the next 10 years is to double their revenue and cut their carbon footprint in half. Okay. They are announcing the first C-level Chief Sustainability Officer. Okay. Paul is so committed to the fact that if we don't transform the infrastructure of the third world, there really isn't any point. And if these products aren't going to be able to be available, and we can't bring this kind of lifestyle, or you can argue whether Ben & Jerry's should be in the third world or not. Okay. But at the same time, everything from a 10 rupee toothbrush, okay, that they've created, and some of these other things, and doing fair trade for tea, and figuring out how their basic ingredients are done in an organic way, in a holistic way, as opposed to the way it's been done in the past. These are the things that Paul's been working on, and he's been working with us on this whole concept of authentic leadership and leading your internal team, and we're working with the top 100 executives through this journey to help them make this kind of a transformation. And all the people we're working with, like the woman who runs South Africa, her purpose in life is to help women who don't have the means to be able to create businesses so that they can sustain their families. And she's doing an enormous amount. The guy who runs Vietnam has built over 1,000 schools in Vietnam for elementary kids. And so there's a lot of things that are happening. So this is one of the examples of where this works. Bill George is my colleague, and he ran Medtronics for 10 years. And he's a wonderful example. He wrote the book True North, and he and I co-wrote the personal guide on True North. And he's basically very disappointed. He's 68, 69. He's very disappointed with his generation relative to their authenticity. And he's been doing a lot of work around how to bring this authenticity to the world. And we've basically been working with a number of executives on what does it look like to make some of these things happen. I think Paul's probably the one that's the easiest to identify just because of the size of Unilever and where it sits in the system. But we've been doing a lot of work with some other executives that are less well known. And in each of the cases, when you step into this place, there's a responsibility for what are we doing within the context of the planet we operate in that just naturally comes out of that, which has just been an interesting process for me to watch instead of pounding on them for doing these things. The journey of the last 5 or 10 years that I've been on and figuring out, 10 years ago, pretty much I'd figured out how we could get people to get to where we wanted to get them to. The problem is they didn't want to go there. So Bill and I collaborated to really take and create the material that we have we did the Harvard study on authentic leadership, and we really looked to figure out what would we need to create that would work for senior executives, people who've never done therapy and never have done any reflection. We believe we have a program, and we have evidence based on having delivered it at the GEs and Unilevers, at Wharton's and other places, where we've got senior executives from all over the place, that in a couple of days we can really get people to step into this and actually really, really enjoy it and want to do more of it. I would say we have about a 60 or 70% success rate. There are some individuals, for example, scientists from very highly intellectual organizations who don't have much of access to their emotional side or any of those things based on the training and what they are, who tend to struggle with this stuff and aren't sure why this would be useful or necessary, okay? So there's still that. But I would say that there's been a huge transformation in the willingness and interest in this, that I don't think that the material we're delivering now we would have been able to do 10 years ago, relative to the willingness of executives to go there. Now, I would also say that many of the executives we work with are senior executives who are being positioned for the top jobs. And the distinction there is they're no longer trying to follow the yellow brick trail and do all the right things. They're now at the place where, the money's not the issue. It's a question of, okay, so do I really want to commit what's necessary to take it to the next level? And it's really about putting who they really are into it, because that's what's going to get evaluated as to, is that the right thing for them, and vice versa. So it's a slightly different criteria that they're looking at as we're working with them. And in that context, we're finding them extremely responsive to doing this. And we're finding people who are all been closet environmentalists or closet feelers or closet, whatever, who are finally coming out and saying, the truth is, this is who I am. I can no longer hide this part of myself. To be authentic, I need to lead from this place. And this may be what the system says you should do, but this is me, and I need to figure out how these two map together. And much of our work is helping them resolve that incongruency, or perceived incongruency, when in many cases the people above are saying, finally, we're going to get the real you, which is what we've been looking for all along, and they're kind of like going, oh my gosh, I thought I was supposed to be this. So I have a lot of hope, I guess is the way I would look at it. I've had the opportunity of working with Carol a great deal. She's been working with us and doing some of the programs at Unilever, and has also worked with Dick Schwartz and I on the Leading Your Internal Team model. Susan I've met and worked with and have interacted with a lot. What's really clear is that these two ladies have a real commitment to creating coaching in a professional way that has the possibility of having it being respected and honored by senior executives and a much higher level of impact than is currently the case. And I think this is an important transformation given where the world is going. We are sitting in the next 10 to 15 years at the lever point of what's going to determine how the next 50 or 60 years ends up playing out. And the momentum that gets created now will be very difficult to change otherwise. So I think that the work that is being done here is much more important than even is stated at the conference relative to having that impact. When the Apollo space missions were being launched, the computers were extremely cumbersome and inaccurate. And what happened was, once they got out of the Earth's orbit, the astronauts had to make a manual adjustment to the trajectory for them to actually hit the moon. And it was at the beginning of the journey. But that one small, slight 1 millimeter adjustment was the difference between whether they hit the moon or not. And I think we're in that time right now. So the importance of the work we're doing here is significant. And 15, 20 years from now, we'll look back and we'll say, okay, that's the thing that contributed to the outcome that we wanted to have happen. So it's good to be a participant in that.